there's a litany of different things that a sponsor can outsource to a vendor. But there is also another component that there's a higher risk and lower risk types of functions that your vendors will do for you. Going back to, it's not one size fits all. It depends on the project. It depends on what you outsource to your vendor. If you go to a CRO, they're doing all your monitoring, they're doing your safety follow-up, if they're writing your safety, your monitoring, your data plans, if they're really doing a lot for you, that's very high risk because that's a huge portion of your research that's being outsourced to another company. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. There's lots of small companies that don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. But at the same time, let's go back all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. This isn't set it, forget it. And you can't just say, you're the expert and I'm trusting you to do everything.
Research quality can feel complex, and knowing where to start is often the hardest part. Welcome to the Quality Assurance Podcast, where we bridge the gap between uncertainty and action with smart, simple, and sustainable solutions that actually work. This special 6-part series is brought to you by PRN Pharmaceutical Research Network, LLC, your partner in ophthalmic clinical research with built-in quality and compliance expertise. Welcome your host, Chris Milawski, alongside the CEO and co-founder of PRN, Jeanette Stewart, and quality assurance expert, Ashley Hehr.
Welcome back, everybody, to the PRN Pharmaceutical Research Network Quality Assurance Podcast. We are joined once again by Jeanette Stewart, who is with PRN Pharmaceutical Research Network, which is the leader in ophthalmology CROs, as well as Ashley Hehr, our quality assurance expert. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
We are in our third session today, and today's topic is going to be vendor oversight. And as we were just talking about, this particular topic has to do with oversight of your vendors after vendors have been selected, correct, Ashley?
That is correct. So this podcast is going to give everybody what to do or how to manage and do management of oversight of your vendors once your quality assurance team has qualified your vendor. And what qualification actually entails is confirming the vendor has the quality system in place, has the appropriate team, and has appropriate processes and systems to do what you need them to do from a study-related duty or function standpoint. So this is after the quality assurance team has assessed a vendor.
After they've assessed the vendor, and obviously during the course of a project, when things are ongoing. And
Correct.
I do know, and I know you know better than I do because of the role that you carry in quality assurance, that probably one of the biggest things you run into is the plain simple fact that maybe some sponsors have a set it and forget it attitude about their vendors. This is what they do for a living, so everything should be fine, right?
Yep. And that is the response I have received so many times from many of the people I've worked with. They go, oh, we're paying this vendor a lot of money and they're the experts. Why should we have to have oversight of them? Well, unfortunately, even with as much money as you can pay somebody, and even if you have the top rated best people from the vendor working on your project, you still have to, from a regulatory standpoint, from an ICH guidance standpoint, there's many instances in which it references that ultimately the sponsor is responsible for ensuring that sponsor-related duties and functions are performed appropriately. So this is how you're able to ensure that your vendors are performing these activities appropriately and correctly, and that's when you need to show that documentation of that.
Very good.
It's really just accountability, isn't it?
Absolutely.
If I hire somebody to paint my house, I might not know all the ins and outs of what they need to do. I hire them because they're the expert, but it doesn't prevent me from going out there every day or two and looking at their progress and asking them, how are things going? Or are you finding anything that's weird?
Yes.
That's what we're talking about, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Ultimately, with your painting contractor, are they using the right color? I mean, you might want to check.
Yes. Are they actually doing what you asked them to do?
Are they doing precisely? And that translates so beautifully across what we're talking about today. It really does. Now, I've talked about picking your vendors, and this is after vendors have been selected. So I know, and I'm sure a lot of people that are watching this as well and are in the industry understand that this is the concept of vendor oversight is not something that's really, it's not willy nilly. There is actually something in the Code of Federal Relations, GCP and ICH guidelines about that this is a thing. And why don't you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes. So ICH E6R3 section 3.6, which I usually don't reference documents or guidelines or anything like that, but there are very specific language within that section. And one of the things actually says, and I'm going to read it directly, it says sponsors should ensure appropriate oversight at activities that are transferred to service providers. So you can't really get out of that. You have to be able to show appropriate oversight. And in our industry, how do we show oversight? By documentation.
Documentation.
So in order to have our oversight, we got to show our documentation. So how do we know what our vendors are doing? What do we know? What are they doing? How are they doing it? Are they meeting our expectations? And that's what we're going to kind of define during today's podcast, is how to ensure you can document it and where are the things that you should be looking, and what are the things you should be looking for.
Absolutely.
That's so
Absolutely.
good. We always go back to, if it's not documented, it's not done. But I think when it comes to this, none of us have the expertise that the vendors have. That's why we outsource to them, right? So it doesn't mean that as they report and then as we provide oversight, that we're going to know all the intricacies of what they do. We're really looking at the deliverables, and are they giving what they said they would give and what's required by the regulations, right?
Absolutely. And how do we start? We start by, from the sponsor standpoint, clearly defining the expectations of the vendor. So what are we expecting from them? This is done usually in a scope of work. What do we want them to do? What are the responsibilities on their end? Are we going to define some deliverables and timelines associated with these activities? And then we're going to establish what we call key performance indicators, or KPIs. And this kind of will help us measure these different deliverables we've asked them to do for us as the sponsor.
I think measure is such an important word, Ashley. If it's great, people can say, yeah, I'm doing this, blah, 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 but there has to be a way to evaluate and measure. And you can't just say, yeah, it looks good, right? There has to be some standards.
Correct. And so how do you make those standards? Where do you document those standards? So there's a couple places that can be documented. Obviously, the scope of work, but that's usually associated with some of the legal paperwork, some of the confidentiality agreements and those type things. So some of the recommendations I have for my clients is do a vendor oversight plan, or a communication plan, or operational plan. And all those different plans in some form or way can describe the deliverables that you're expecting and the timelines associated with that. And then who on the vendor side should be completing those activities. So if they say that they're going to have team XYZ completing a task, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait, why is this team performing this? You told me this team was. Refer back to a plan and say, this is what was agreed upon. How does that team have the expertise to be performing what I've asked them to do?
Correct.
And Ashley, how would you expect them to demonstrate that expertise?
So I'd expect them to demonstrate that expertise in obviously discussing it with the different team members, their knowledge of their processes and procedures, being able to demonstrate. So do they have a plan in place, or do they have a process that they follow, or a system that they follow that they can show me that they're using? And so I would expect some type of, like we go back to, measured deliverable. So what can they provide me to show me that they are able to actually perform the duties that we have asked them to do?
And that could actually be, as a beginning starting place, could be as simple as, here's the CV of the person, which shows you that they have the training and experience to do this for us within this plan, right?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I actually recommend to some of my clients, is to put in there, if there does happen to be someone that's taken off a project and needs to be replaced, that you as the client would like to review the CV of the potential candidates, so that you can ensure that they're fulfilling that position with someone that is appropriately trained and experienced for that job. And there's no harm in doing that. You're just simply performing an oversight activity as the sponsor.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And really, you're saying to the vendor, can you demonstrate redundancy? that
Yep.
if something happens, you can assign somebody else who is qualified, right?
Correct.
Or capable. Yeah.
Correct. Exactly. So then how do we actually, what are some of measurable deliverables? Some people ask me, how would I be able to measure some of these deliverables? First thing that I always say is let's make timelines. What is your expectation of a report to be done? How about data queries to be resolved? How about safety processing, training? These are all things that you can put a timeline associated with, obviously a reasonable timeline, but those are things that are easy to track. And then also things like quality metrics, any type of deviations that they've had from their processes or procedures. How do they report that? How many deviations do they have? And then compliance, obviously, training completion, monitoring report completion, like I just said, timelines associated with those specific deliverables. And how often should they be reviewed? Really, that's just dependent on, I would say, regularly, not quarterly, but regularly as the work is being done.
Absolutely. I think it bears noting at this point as well for maybe some newer sponsors who are getting into space and trying to figure out, I don't really want to say the nuance of clinical research, but there's a lot of moving part. Just discovering your compound is only the beginning, and that how you matriculate through the whole process is something that can be quite daunting. Thinking about QA early and often is extremely important, because the better information that you put in place in the beginning, then the better product you're going to have at the end. The less chance you're going to have to redo something. We don't want to have to redo something unless it's absolutely positively necessary. But I think the fact that the ICH guidelines even cover quality assurance in outsourcing items to vendors and tasks to vendors, which again, and I think you would probably agree, there's different levels. You can do a
Yes.
little bit of outsourcing. You can do full complete outsourcing.
Correct.
And no matter what outsourcing that you're doing, you selected your quality vendor. They're the best in industry and whatnot. But there's that old saying, trust but verify. That I think when you start into this and you start to see the landscape and how big it can be, that needs to be a mantra that a lot of companies need to take on very soon, very early on in the process. And QA, quality assurance, is the perfect vehicle for doing this, because you want to assure your quality. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So,
Chris, let me
Thanks.
ask you this. You just said you don't want to have to redo things. And this raises a scenario that I wanted to ask both of you about. You're a sponsor, you have a team that you put together for a project, and then you start another project, and you really think this team has done well. They've met all their metrics, they've reported on time, they've done everything that should be done as a good vendor. Then do you just put in your new plan, we're just going to use the same old people because you don't want to redo things? How do you manage that?
Go ahead, Ashley.
I think if you have supporting documentation show that team performed to the level of expectation, then I'm okay with saying I would like to use the same team members. However, we're going to revisit our plans. We're going to revisit our expectations. We're going to revisit our timeline. But the real question I point to is, was there true vendor oversight? Did you just like the people and their personalities, or were you actually assessing, and do you have documentation to show they met their timelines, they completed their training, they did all the activities that we expect them to do? If you can prove that, I'm okay with using the same team members, but you need to revisit the project for the specific project you're doing. So reevaluate the plans, reevaluate the timelines. So I think you really have to look in the mirror and say, did I truly oversee and assess this vendor appropriately?
Yeah. I think I'd add to that, Jeanette, as well. It can be very unique to the situation if you are a small company that does nothing but ophthalmology and you're working with the same vendors across your projects. There's one thing. If all you're doing is glaucoma studies, then the vendors that you've used will probably suffice for what you want. Going back to the discussion we had regarding SOPs, a lot of SOPs will have regarding vendor selection. SOP will say, if you've used the vendor within the past, however many months, probably no more than 2 years, I would think. But if they're active with your company, That makes a difference. If you've used them before, but perhaps they were too busy to take on your last two projects, you would probably want to go back in and do vendor oversight again, just to make sure. And then if you're a company, like maybe a medium-sized company, you are doing therapy areas across different therapy areas. You might be doing some glaucoma, you might be doing some dry eye. You might also have some retina studies. Different teams are going to be more designed towards doing different functions, especially at the monitoring level, right? So you're going to want to have staff in place that if you're doing a retina study, you're going to usually want staff, CRAs that have done retina studies before. That's one of the things you're going to look for, or a vendor, a CRO that has some experience with retina studies. If you get to the size of a Pfizer, where you're doing, I don't even know how many different therapy areas they work in anymore, but I'm sure they have extremely robust and strict SOPs regarding vendor oversight, so that they may go through their process for every project, as opposed to staff vendors they've used in the past and whatnot. So it's not one size fits all. It depends on the scenario. But going back to Ashley's point and the overarching discussion of quality assurance, every new project you're going to want to go back and retouch, just to make sure that your vendors are still meeting the expectations and what you're going to need them to do for this new project. So
We're going to take a brief pause here for a quick note from our sponsor. You're watching the Quality Assurance Podcast, smart, simple, and sustainable solutions, brought to you by PRN Pharmaceutical Research Network, LLC. If you're finding these solutions helpful, don't miss an episode of this 6-part series. Hit that follow or subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform right now. Don't miss our downloadable show notes and freebies. Just click the link in the description to go directly to PRN's site to download the materials and get more information about the QA program, this episode, and other episodes as they become available. Now back to Chris, Jeanette, and Ashley.
Yeah, both of you hit on the points that I was thinking. It is fine, but make sure you update your plans and you truly do examine them and make sure the team is really a good fit for the new project.
absolutely.
Great discussion. This is fun.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the things we kind of hadn't hit on yet is really the documentation around it. So we talked about timelines, deliverables, but really, how do you document that? And there's a couple of different ways that I encourage my clients to make sure that they are documenting it. So either in meeting minutes, where the discussions show who was in attendance, what was discussed. One of the things I really like are issue, decision, and response logs. I think that is something that is very useful. It can identify any type of issue, any type of decision, what was decided, who was involved in that decision, and when it was determined going forward to use or to implement. So that can be very useful from an oversight standpoint. Also can be great to use if there's a transition that happens during the study. If somebody comes off the project and then comes back on, you can use that to show what has actually been decided and discussed. And if it's used correctly and actually used in real time and as things are being documented, discussed, it actually speaks for itself and it allows to tell the story about how the project progressed. And then also there's also audits and assessments that can be done periodically by QA. One of the things you brought up, Chris, was about doing reassessment. So a lot of times once a vendor has been qualified by the quality team, usually there's a 2 or 3 year reassessment of the vendor to look if there's been any type of quality structure or change in their executive management, any type of restructuring or reorganization. What have they added in systems? What have they added in process and the procedures? So reassessing those vendors from a quality standpoint, but then also doing what we call in-process audits. Because I feel like I can assess a vendor and say, oh, they have great processes in place, but until they actually use those processes and provide the deliverable associated with it, I really can't tell if they're truly following or not. So encouraging to have in-process audits completed as you're using a vendor to make sure they are following the processes and procedures. And then obviously having all of that documented.
Yeah. Great points.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think maybe one more thing that, and we might have touched upon this a little bit because we did talk about that. There's a litany of different things that a sponsor can outsource to a vendor. But there is also another component that there's higher risk and lower risk types of functions that your vendors will do for you. Going back to, it's not one size fits all. It depends on the project. It depends on what you outsource to your vendor. If you go to a CRO, they're doing all your monitoring, they're doing your safety follow-up, if they're writing your safety, your monitoring, your data plans, if they're really doing a lot for you, that's very high risk, because that's that's a huge portion of your research that's being outsourced to another company. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. There's lots of small companies that don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. But at the same time, let's go back all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. This isn't set it, forget it. And you can't just say, you're the expert and I'm trusting you to do everything. You may get back a wonderful quality product. There's absolutely no doubt. There's absolutely positive. You might get something back, but you better trust, but verify, because there's with as many moving parts as we talked about, you could get something really ugly back that you don't like.
Yep. And that's where ensuring that the team members that are responsible or managing the vendor. So quality assurance does the qualification. You have your operations, you have safety, you have data management. All of those teams could be using vendors, and whoever is managing that vendor really should be ensuring that quality assurance is communicated on the issues and on the areas. So things like you just said, these considered high-risk vendors, they're ensuring patient safety. They're handling our data, ensuring data integrity. Those are areas that I consider higher risk. And that's where you want to make sure that person that's managing the vendor has a pulse on what is going on and is including quality management when there are issues, because it's okay to have issues. We will talk about this next week. Everybody makes mistakes, and that is okay. But the big thing is, when you identify there's an issue, are you correctly communicating it? Are you ensuring that the risk assessment, the root cause analysis has been completed? And is there a process or a follow-up put into place? And that doesn't have to necessarily fall on the person that's managing the vendor. You want to bring your quality assurance team in to help you ensure that is appropriately assessed and documented. So one of the examples I'm going to give is, say you have a monitor that had to go out of office unexpectedly. She just became sick and was gone, and her monitoring visit report was due, and you have 7 days or whatever, 5 to 7 days after the visit to complete the report and put it in the system. This vendor didn't have a good backup plan in place. And so the person that was supposed to take the work from the monitor and complete the report and do what needed to do to push it through the system for the timeline didn't do that role. And so the monitoring report became late or was late. So what's the root cause analysis? Oh, we realize our vendor does not have a good backup plan in place if somebody were to go out unexpectedly. So let's go ahead, revisit that. Let's ensure that there is documented expectation if there is a monitor to go out, so that going forward, if this does happen again, we have a process in place and we don't have a late report.
Absolutely. Great example. Absolutely. Because certainly at the clinical affairs level, one of our key deliverables is generally getting reports turned around and on time so that information can be disseminated. And really, it boils down to a dissemination of information. We want to try and get the sponsor the information as quickly as possible when things are done. Back in the day, I think we all remember the 3-part NCR days when we were collecting. Our data tool was a 3-part NCR where you'd collect the white and the yellows and the pinks would stay on site. So we would have, you needed to change data at the site. It's called data change form. And so there was all kinds of paper.
Through a fax machine.
But before that, it was all fax. And before that, it was, I don't want to admit it, but there's plenty of companies that you stick it in your briefcase and bring it back with you on the airplane, which can be quite disastrous when you think about it. But those were back in the days where you waited for your data. You really did. They collected the information. It was on paper. It went in-house to sponsor or CRO, whoever's doing it, double data entry so that they could compare and contrast to make sure that the information in the system correct. Then it would get cleaned up a bit, and then it would finally go to sponsor. You're talking about months before that information gets in. But your report is rather important, because if you had an SAE that didn't get reported on time, you had 100% staff turnover at your study site for whatever reason, it could be months before your sponsor knows about that. Now, in the electronic age, We don't have to really worry about that now. But it all boils down to the key deliverable is the report gets turned in on time, it gets finished, reviewed, turned in sponsor, and the information gets disseminated as quickly as possible so that they can make decisions regarding, is our quality assurance plan being followed? And are there gaps? Is there a problem somewhere? Do we need a CAPA in place? All of those things. So this is a great discussion because, again, it does show all of those components have got to be feeding in together to really assure quality. This is what we're trying to do, is we're assuring quality.
I think that really brings us back to the very beginning. Why do we do vendor oversight? It's not because you want to be mean and nasty and beat people up and tell them they're doing a bad job. It's to assure the validity of the results and the safety of patients and all the good things that we're trying to accomplish. We just need to make sure that those things are done well. And therein lies vendor oversight, right?
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you both again for a great discussion. It's been fantastic. Like I said, this is where our third installment, and we're really getting into the heart of the matter here when it comes to quality assurance. And these are great discussions. And I hope everybody who's tuning in is going to find a lot of this information very good. We're happy to be here to present it to you. So thank you once again to both Jeanette and Ashley. We will see everybody on the next podcast. So take care, and we'll see you next time.
Until then,
Thank you.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Quality Assurance Podcast, a 6-part series dedicated to making research quality smart, simple, and sustainable. Our thanks to Jeanette Stewart and Ashley Hehr for their expertise, and to our sponsor, PRN Pharmaceutical Research Network, LLC, for making this series possible. Be sure to tune in to the next episode as we tackle the industry's QA challenges and offer ideas you can actually use. Smart, simple, and sustainable.